or take themselves off mute to speak.
All right, do you want to get things going?
Yeah, all right. That's all right, Corinne. All right, good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen. Let's make sure sharing the right thing. There we go. All right, so I believe, let me just pull this over so I can see. All right, can everybody see everything okay? I think I can actually see everything. All right, awesome. So you are in our 8:45 session. This is called Understanding and Confronting Sex Trafficking and Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. That is a mouthful, but we are really going to break it down today, make this digestible and something that we are able to talk about and have some open discussions around. So your presenters for today, my name is Michelle McDyer. I am the Prevention, Education, and Outreach Manager at Mission Kids Child Advocacy Center. We are coming from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. For those of you who are familiar, we are right outside of Philadelphia. We are a mix of mostly suburban. We do have some urban areas and some more rural areas, but we are the third largest, most densely populated county in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia County and Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh. So we have a pretty good mix of folks in our county, and we're really excited to share about the work that we've done here today. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So my name is Hannah Cornell. I also work at Mission Kids Child Advocacy Center. I am the External Affairs Manager there. When I joined Mission Kids about 3 years ago, I started out as the Stop Human Trafficking Grants Manager. And closer to the end of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the work that we did as a county, creating a replicable response to child sex trafficking and adult sex trafficking as well.
Thank you. And I think we want to launch our first poll here to see who's in the room. So yeah, we just want to see who's in the room, give the option. Sorry, I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. First, we want to make sure we already introduced the CSEC, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. I know we said that's a mouthful. We'll be referring to it as CSEC. But we do just want to acknowledge that a lot of the concepts that we're going to cover today can be difficult or upsetting, disturbing to some participants. These are difficult subjects to talk about, and we know you're jumping right in at 8:45 on a Wednesday morning. But we hope that we can have some worthwhile and meaningful discussions and find comfort in our discomfort. So we just appreciate you taking the time and energy this morning to learn more about these crimes that are committed against children and ways that we can best support them. And we want this to be a safe space. I know that there is a breakout room for anyone who needs some self-care, but we will also leave our contact information if you want to debrief or follow up in any way. So our first poll is who's in the room? So what best describes your role as an advocate? And we're looking to see who is in the room. Are you representing a child advocacy center, domestic violence agency, elder victims of crime, immigration, LGBTQIA+, children with disabilities, adults with disabilities, mental health or therapy, or other? And if you represent other, you can also put that in the chat box so we can see that as well. I think it's showing both of our polls right now. All right, so we are looking for the poll that says best describes your role as an advocate. Can you see that?
Yeah, I think it's up over in the side, but I think a lot of people are using the chat box as well.
Oh, perfect. You can do that as well. Let's see. So we say, oh, someone has a dual sexual advocate or sexual assault and DV, licensed therapist, victim advocate for the DA's office, Office of Victim Advocate. Ooh, Erie has a comprehensive center. I love that. VCAP, our trusted friends over at VCAP. Awesome. Great. Well, I'm glad to see that we have a good range of folks here. I did realize I didn't explain, if you are not familiar with the Child Advocacy Center, we serve child victims of abuse. So that could be sexual abuse, physical neglect, commercial sexual exploitation of children, any kind of crimes that are committed against children or that they witness. And we provide forensic interviews and family advocacy services for them. But another big portion of what we do is prevention education like this, getting out into the community and sharing. A lot of people I know are speaking to the choir here, but realizing that these crimes are prevalent and that they are happening in our community and ways that we can help. So our learning objectives today, I know we have about an hour and a half, so we're going to start out with baseline knowledge, defining the concepts of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children. We'll briefly talk about the federal and Pennsylvania state laws that are in place related to these crimes, but by no means will this be any kind of law lecture. Next, we'll talk about the vulnerabilities and risk factors that make a child more susceptible to exploitation. And that'll be identifying red flags and indicators that children who have been exploited may present. Next, we'll move into methods of recruitment and conditioning that are used by exploiters and traffickers, and that'll help you better understand and respond to that complex trauma that is experienced by child victims. And then finally, what we're most excited about is talking about what we've done here in Montgomery County to respond to these cases of commercial sexual exploitation. And we will give you a huge toolbox full of ways that you can bring back to your county, show ways that you can implement these policies and procedures to best support victims in your community. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah for Mythbusters and our friend Liam Neeson.
All right, so we like to start off the presentation by just right off the bat confronting a couple myths and misconceptions. And I think that the movie Taken, which you can see Liam Neeson here on the screen, is a great example of all of sort of the myths that are perpetuated around this topic. We did just recently do a training for a younger group, and I'm realizing maybe Taken isn't that relevant anymore, because some of them had never heard of it, so I hope it's still resonating with folks. But so some of the common myths, and again, these are like all the things perpetuated and Taken, what a lot of people possess perceptions around, right, is that if we ask, like, picture a victim of CSEC, picture a victim of sex trafficking, a lot of people are going to picture a female, someone who's a foreign national, and maybe that it's not even happening in the United States, right? So a lot of people think that this is a foreign problem that impacts foreign nationals. So it's not happening here. But something that we do know is that most victims of sex trafficking are in the United States, and they're U.S. citizens, right? So 85% of victims in the United States are U.S. citizens. So this is certainly something that is happening here, and it's certainly something that's happening in our backyards, right? So another misconception, right, is that victims are often female and that the traffickers and sex buyers are male. Largely across the board, this is true. Most victims of CSEC are female, do identify as female, and most traffickers and sex buyers are male. However, we really want to expand our thinking on this topic. A number of different research studies have shown that up to about 31% of child victims of sex trafficking identify as male. So really expanding our understanding, because oftentimes when we're not thinking of those who identify as male, we're less likely to identify them, right? And then the last point, transportation. I think the concept and the word trafficking makes us think a lot of times that there has to be some sort of movement. However, that is only one of the acts that constitute human trafficking, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But some people can be trafficked and never leave their home. They might be trafficked by a family member, by a parent. Again, some studies have shown that up to 45% of victims of child trafficking are trafficked by a family member. I'm not sure if it's me, but I think I'm getting like a little bit of feedback. So if you aren't on mute, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, that would be wonderful. Oh, it stopped. Perfect. Thank you, guys. So now moving on, we're going to show a little video here. So again, a lot of this work emerged out of our Stop Human Trafficking grant that was awarded to Mission Kids in Montgomery County. And we were so fortunate to work with survivors of sex trafficking, and they were paid expert consultants. So really thankful to have our work products, our response really informed by the survivor voice. But because we don't have a survivor presenting this morning, we want to go ahead and play this video to really elevate the voices of survivors and hear from those with lived experience.
I grew up in a household of violence.
It's the story. I mean, it is the story of foster girls that I know.
The brown and blacks they're throwaways. A lot of the kids are throwaways.
And then we found some guy on Craigslist that said he was doing swimsuit modeling.
The goal was to get the money so I can get the apartment, so I can get my son back.
I couldn't do those things that I would do with those men unless I was high.
At that time period, there wasn't systems in place to give me the follow-up care and the services that I needed.
All right. So for those of you who are interested, we're going to play one more video from that particular resource. It's called thelifestory.org, and it is really fabulous. It's a bunch of vignettes of survivors talking about their own lived experience. All right. So moving on, we are going to start out with creating some common language by defining a lot of the terms that we're going to talk about today. So what is CSEC? CSEC is right in our title, and I think everyone in this field really resonates with the fact that I think we love acronyms, right? But I just want to make sure that we're clearly defining what commercial sexual exploitation of children is, and we're going to refer to it throughout this presentation as CSEC. So CSEC is a range of crimes and activities that involve the sexual abuse or exploitation of a child in exchange for anything of value. So those last three words, anything of value. A lot of times when people think about sex trafficking, they think about CSEC, they're thinking a sex act in exchange for money. But again, just broadening our understanding of what that looks like. Anything of value, it could be a sex act in exchange for food, for a warm meal. Maybe it's for shelter, for a roof over their heads, a couch to sleep on. Maybe it's for drugs. Maybe it is for money. It could even be something that's less tangible. It could be a feeling of safety, a feeling of protection. So something with CSEC is that it may or may not include elements of force, fraud, or coercion. So if a child's presenting to you and they say, I chose to do this, which a lot of times we know, and Michelle's going to dive into the reasons behind that later, that kids are presenting saying, I chose to do this. Nobody made me do this. I'm choosing to exchange sex for, say, marijuana, say, a couch to sleep on. That's still sex trafficking. That's still CSEC because a child absolutely cannot consent. And we really want to focus on the individuals who are benefiting from that, whether it be the sex buyers or the traffickers. So CSEC also includes CSAM. And again, it's another one of our acronyms, right? So that's child sexual abuse materials, also known as child pornography. So anytime there's materials that are exchanged for something of value, that constitutes CSEC. And with the huge rise of CSAM recently, given COVID, we did really just want to call that out. So CSEC is often used interchangeably with sex trafficking by a lot of experts in the field, although some instances of CSEC might not meet the federal legal definition of sex trafficking, which we are going to pull up on the screen here next. So this is the US federal law. A way that we like to break this down is the AMP model. So it's acts by a means for a purpose. And you can see the giant red cross out of means, right? So for adults, it is an act by a means. There has to be an element of force, fraud, and coercion to prove sex trafficking for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation. However, if that individual is under the age of 18, like we talked about in the last slide, we only need an act for a purpose. So if we can't identify any element of force, fraud, or coercion, nobody is making this child do that, it doesn't matter. It's still sex trafficking. Again, kids cannot legally consent to sex like this. All right, so the purpose, it acts for a purpose. So what is that purpose? The purpose is always commercial sexual exploitation. So a commercial sex act is really a sex act where there's anything of value exchange. So again, we talked about this in the slide before. So you can see a couch, we can see a meal from McDonald's, maybe it's getting your nails done, a new purse, maybe it's sending money through Venmo. All of these things are something of value.
And as Hannah mentioned before, we did want to share some situations because it's not always the Liam Neeson situation where there's going to be a father that is going to travel to the ends of the earth to save this child that's been trafficked across the globe. But these are kind of situations that we might see that might come to a child advocacy center for services. So obviously we've changed any names and identifying characteristics, but this really summarizes what we see, where Devante could be a 14-year-old who's run away and is exchanging oral sex in order to have a safe place to sleep at night. Brittany could be 17 years old and meet up with men she talks to online who promise to buy her alcohol in exchange for dates. Crystal, age 12, sends pictures and videos of sex acts over Snapchat for access to marijuana. And Jordan's mom is struggling financially and promises her landlord that he can have sex with her daughter, age 15, in exchange for 1 month's rent expenses. So I think one thread that really runs through this are these acts of desperation or lack of choice, or where people are in some tight situations where they're looking for a safe place to stay or looking for something like a month's rent. But it could also be children who don't have the ability to consent to something like this. And you'll see that as we move through this presentation.
Thanks, Michelle. So we are going to not do a deep dive at 9 a.m. into the law on human trafficking, but I think the biggest call out here in looking at this slide is that Pennsylvania didn't get its first anti-trafficking statute until 2014. That is kind of mind-blowing to me, right? So our federal government, what we talked about, the AMP model, the federal TVPA, that was passed in 2000, which still feels fairly new. But it wasn't until 14 years later that Pennsylvania actually got the tools it needed to prosecute traffickers, to prosecute sex buyers, and to really have enhanced protections for victims of sex trafficking. And we were actually one of the last states to get that statute on the books. So the other law here, again, and I think that the biggest takeaway here is just how new these laws are. 2018 was when our safe harbor law was passed. So prior to December of 2018, a child, anyone under the age of 18, could be arrested as a child prostitute. just letting that sink in, right? We know that children cannot consent to sex, that arresting a child for prostitution is not in line with our statutory rape laws, right? So I just think that's shocking. So what the safe harbor law does is it ensures protections and actually legally recognizes kids as what they are. They are victims of a crime. And so it's really creating dependency in lieu of delinquency, getting those kids the services that they need instead of criminalizing them. Just so crucial. All right, so I'm pretty sure that every single person probably at this whole conference is a mandated reporter. So we just want to call out, again, 2016, very, very recent, that added the definition of perpetrator under the CPSL for a trafficker. That wasn't previously in there. And then it added a 10th category to the definition of child abuse in the CPSL. So anytime we have a suspicion that a child is engaged in a commercial sex act, that they're in the sex trade, right? We need to make that mandated report, any suspicion at all.
So here's an example we wanted to share with you and see if you think that this would generate or require a child line report. But in your profession, a colleague shares with you that they encountered a situation in which a 15-year-old client that you both know disclosed that while he was spending time on the streets, he performed a sex act with someone in order to be able to earn some cash quickly. The client assures that he made the choice to perform the sex act and that nobody forced him into doing anything that he was not comfortable with. And this is in the polling section, or you can just write it in the chat if that's easier. But upon hearing this information, is your colleague required to make a child line report? And are you required to make a child line report? All right, looks like we have 80, getting up there, almost to 90% yes. Some people are unsure. In the chat box, we have yes and no, yes, report, required to report. Awesome. So the answer is yes, you are both required to make a child line report under the CPSL law that changed in 2015. Again, even though this child is 15, he says that he was not forced into doing anything that he was not comfortable with. You are both required to make a child line report. All right.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities and the risk factors, as well as the red flags that we can look for as service providers. Again, we're going to start out with another video from the life story, and this particular video and vignette is really focused around runaways, but I think it perfectly encapsulates the vulnerabilities and risk factors that traffickers prey upon.
I was staying in a house where there was about 6 other kids staying. It was the basement of somebody's grandmother's house, and we were all living down there, and it was rat infested, and we all had scabies, and I mean, it was disgusting, but it was a place to live.
It was one day we were at the transit center and didn't really have anywhere to go, and that's kind of where everybody hung out at the time.
I was just kind of couch surfing, living where I could, staying where I could. And then one day
I was sitting at a bus stop with a friend, and a lady rolled up with a really nice car.
I was at the grocery store in the parking lot, and I met There was a group of guys out there.
She was like, I would like to hang out with you guys if you guys want to hang out.
And they all had really nice cars and they all had really nice jewelry.
They were like in this really fancy hotel with the hot tub in it.
Smelled really good and were good looking and all of that. One of the guys in particular came over to me and started talking to me, and he wanted to know where my family was. He wanted to know my situation. He wanted to know a lot about me. And in my mind, I was thinking it was because he was interested in me and he just wanted to know me as a person.
Kept ordering food and bottles and everything, and I was kind of like, where they kind of like explained like what she did and his part in it.
And he started slowly talking about prostitution.
I've never even heard of a prostitute before, and then that was the day that I actually finally met one.
You know, he had a nice car, he had money, he had clothes, he had all the stuff that I didn't have and that I wanted. I grew up in a really alcoholic home, a lot of violence, a lot of yelling, things being thrown, people being hit. It wasn't a happy place.
Me and my uncle got in a lot of fights, physical fights, and that's kind of when I started like veering towards the streets, because I never wanted to be home around my mom and my uncle because they were always so mean to me.
When I was 15, I got pregnant, and my father abandoned me. He told me to never come back, so I never went back. So I was on my own after that.
I didn't have any like rules. I could come and go as I pleased. So I could stay out for a couple days and come home and change, or I could stay out until 3, 4 in the morning and come home, sleep. I started stealing from stores, hanging out in abandoned buildings.
I didn't have any money. I didn't have any way to make money, and I didn't have anywhere to live with my child. So he went with his father's family. A lot of my friends' moms that were single would let me stay, but I had no permanent home.
There's people that are out there that are predators, that target young people, that they know that they can target them because they need a place to stay or something to eat.
You know, I think I was so beat down and so just my self-esteem was so gone that at that point, I think I accepted that this is what I was going to do, and that this is what I was and this is what I was worth.
At the end of the year, when I was 11, we were sitting at the bus stop, and there was another girl there that was like crying and stuff. Well, she had just got kicked out of her place, and she didn't have anywhere to go. So we all kind of put our head together about like what needed to be done in order to get some money so that we can get a hotel room. That's when my friend that was with me when we met the girl at the hotel was like, well, I have an idea on what we can do, and all decided to go to Pack Highway and walk down the street and make some money. When I seen the girl do it, she said $100. She said $100. That's how much that they're supposed to pay. So when he asked me how much, I said $100, and he said okay. That was kind of how that started. Wow, it was the first time that I did that.
So I know Hannah's really going to break down a lot of the risk factors that are evident in that video. But before we move on, I know there was a question about a third party hearing a report. So the CPSL law changed in 2015 as a result of the Jerry Sandusky case. That was a case where everyone kind of thought that someone else was going to report. So it does require that upon hearing this information that you make a report. There are situations, for example, at a child advocacy center, if a child discloses something new, like a new piece of information during a forensic interview, where the team decides who's going to be the one to make the report. Our policy at Mission Kids is that the forensic interviewer always makes the report. so they know it's already predetermined who's going to be the person making the report, so they have a group consensus. But if it's in a situation where like a social service agency is providing social services for a client that you both work with, you should both make a report. You can make a supplemental report, and it just gets filed under child line so that they have more information. I hope that's what you're asking. I know that the laws are super confusing. We are in the process right now of going through approval for mandated reporter training, because we realize what is out there can be super confusing. So I hope that was helpful, Corinne. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn it back over to Hannah to talk about the risk factors.
Thanks, Michelle. So, I mean, that video is so powerful. No matter how many times I watch it, something new jumps out at me. And I think this time it was the woman at the end talking about the first time that she did that. Her and her friends put their heads together. She was 11 years old. So that just really sticks with me. So looking at risk factors, I think a lot of the times we tend to really hone in and focus on individual risk factors, which is great, which is good. But I think just taking a couple steps back from that and expanding our understanding of what really puts somebody at risk. So that outer level is societal risk factors. We live in a society that really hypersexualizes young bodies and that almost accepts commercial sex. We think about maybe a lot of the songs, whether they're older like Snoop Dogg or newer like Doja Cat, but there's a lot of songs and media out there that normalize the exchange of sex for something of value. And so kids, and people are hearing this over and over again, there are apps like, oh, Michelle, I'm drawing a blank, the Cash App. What am I thinking of? The one that we always...
OnlyFans?
Yes, OnlyFans. Sorry, I was drawing a blank. OnlyFans, which is literally Pornhub meets Instagram. You put your images out there and people subscribe to your content. We know in developed nations, actually, there's normally a greater risk because there is such a normalization of commercial sex. So in general, citizens of the US, citizens in our society, we're at risk because of these values and perceptions that we have around commercial sex. Certainly community risk factors. We hear a lot about that in the video we just watched. Maybe there's not a lot of supports. Maybe the community is under-resourced, the neighborhood's under-resourced, and there's not a lot of structure. Maybe there's a lot of gang involvement. We know that sometimes gang involvement and sex trafficking can go hand in hand. Relational risk factors. A lot of the women in that video talked about they grew up in a household of violence. They grew up with alcoholism in the family. It's a huge risk factor. And then we can see some individual risk factors there, which we're going to go into a little bit in the next slide. But I think the biggest call out here is if somebody doesn't fit into the categories of these individual risk factors, it certainly doesn't mean that they can't be a victim of trafficking. They could have none of the risk factors that are listed right here on the screen, and they could exist in a society, in a community, in a relationship, in a family system that puts them at risk anyways. So we are just going to call out a couple of the main individual risk factors. Certainly across the board, research shows, anecdotal experience for the work that we do at Mission Kids is that about 90% of CSEC victims have a prior history of child sexual abuse. That is absolutely astounding. I mean, 90%, that is so significant. A lot of the kids that we see at Mission Kids who are suspected victims of CSEC, we've seen them before for prior allegations. So that's a huge risk factor. A behavioral health factor might be running away from home, and we certainly see how running away from home and child sexual abuse can often go hand in hand. Maybe they're escaping that situation, but certainly traffickers prey on individuals who are fleeing the home, who are in desperate situations, looking for food, shelter, and having many of their basic needs met. Demographic factors. Surprisingly, this is a less important predictor than a lot of times we think. Again, demographics are not really as important. probably one of the biggest ones to take away is that youth are extremely vulnerable. But certainly groups like the LGBTQIA community and people of color are more at risk than others. And we talked about environmental factors, right? Dysfunctional family systems, family environments, maybe living in a household of poverty where basic needs aren't guaranteed, and children are expected maybe to exchange sex in order to meet those needs for the family. All right. So again, because a lot of you are so engaged and involved in this work, we just want to talk about a group that's particularly at high risk. It's kids that are in out-of-home placements, whether that be foster care, residential treatment facility, shelter. They are much, much more likely to be trafficked. And studies actually show that between 50 and 90% of children who are involved in child welfare services are victims of trafficking. So again, just really noting that the list that we talked about, the individual risk factors, all the levels of risk factors, we certainly know this list, but unfortunately, traffickers know it even better. They are particularly recruiting kids who they know they can more easily entice into this life, whether that means waiting outside of group homes or sending kids to recruit from within into these different facilities.
I did just want to share a quick anecdote here that I just thought of as I'm looking at it. And I know we're going to talk about what we're doing here in Montco in a little bit, but we do have a new program called Not a Number training for teenagers ages 12 through 18. And we just wrapped up our 5th module. So we do 5 50-minute sessions. And we did them at our youth center this week. So children that were living in the youth shelter side. And we were shocked, but also, I don't know the word for it, but when we were talking about these concepts, it was nothing new to these kids. We had a group of 5 to 7 kids each day. I say kids, they're teenagers, usually around ages 12 through 16 that were present. And all of this was new to them, or was what they knew, and they wanted to talk about it. We were finally able to come in and present to them a lesson where they were like, yeah, I know this happens. I know what this looks like. And they were living in the youth shelter. So it just speaks to how prevalent this is and how ingrained it is in their lives. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what that looks like.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad you called that out. I feel like it was like we were learning from them and they were learning from us. Like they're the experts, like they're living this, and we wanted to hear from them. So this is our CSEC continuum, which is just flashing across the screen right now. But if you can catch what it's saying, basically we're just highlighting the point that between 70 and 90% of CSEC victims have a prior history of sexual abuse. And we can see how over time, those who have experienced childhood sexual abuse are more easily enticed and recruited into the life. So say the sexual abuse begins at a young age, that really alters that individual's perception of themselves, maybe as being only good for sex, as linking sex with love, but also of the world, right? People just want to use me as a sex object, etc. So maybe they flee the life. Maybe they're online looking for somebody or that connection. And we see how traffickers, again, they know that list of vulnerabilities. They're recruiting these kids. They're looking for kids who need their basic needs met, who need their emotional and psychological needs met. And so they're reaching out to them. And we can see how enticing that might be for a child who's experienced child sexual abuse. And we could see how maybe that love, that affection would draw them in. And when the abuse begins, that totally fits in with their perception of themselves and of the world.
Hopefully no one got seasick, but you're all awake. You got to see it flash across your screen.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the stages of grooming. And I feel like we've talked a little bit about this throughout the presentation. But again, what are traffickers doing? This is really like a business model to these individuals. You can get on Amazon. There are literally books written by pimps saying step 1, step Step 2, outlining these stages of grooming. Because for a lot of these individuals, this is their full-time job. This is their business model. So what do? We talked about this. They target the victim. They're looking for people with noticeable vulnerabilities. Then they're gaining trust. They're gaining information. And maybe they do that by flipping through their social media profile. We hear of a lot of cases at Mission Kids where the trafficker will friend all of their friends online to make it look like there's somebody in their network. We had the pleasure and the privilege of working with a survivor on another training we did. And she talked about that her trafficker was her pastor. He was already somebody that was incredibly trusted in her community and incredibly trusted by her family. And then the trafficker works by filling a need, ensuring that that victim is totally dependent on them. Maybe, like we talked about, it's physical needs, but a lot of times it's that emotional need. And so then they begin isolating them. So maybe they're sort of feigning this love relationship, a friendship, a benefactor, a parental figure. But over time, they begin isolating them from the supports that the child might have had before. Like maybe they had a supportive family system. Maybe they had a network of friends. But over time, they're distancing that child from their support network. And that's when the abuse begins. A trafficker might say, hey, if you love me, if you care about me, you'll go out tonight and make X amount of dollars. And then over time, that abuse continues and the trafficker maintains control. All right, so some recruitment tactics. Again, this is taken from a book that is on Amazon called How to Be a Pimp, using Maslow's hierarchy of human needs to make the most money. Again, this is a business model for these people. I can't reiterate that enough. So meeting physiological needs, and maybe they're meeting safety needs by consistently meeting their basic needs, by providing them with that safety. Then they're meeting belongingness and love needs, whether that's a friendship, a parental figure, maybe acting as a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Esteem needs, feelings of accomplishment, feeling sort of this self-worth. We talked to another survivor of trafficking who said her trafficker only recruited individuals who were go-getters, who he really saw as having drive and motivation because he knew that they would go far in the life. And then that last step, self-actualization, achieving one's full potential. So even in this book, it talks about that your woman will help you recruit new women. She'll think that she's your business partner. So that's the goal, is to convince your victims that they're actually your business partner and that they'll entice and recruit and lure more individuals into this life.
And when we talk about recruitment locations, I think the biggest takeaway here is that it's anywhere that youth or other vulnerable people spend time. So this is something that's happening at schools, on social media, which we're seeing so much more of. As a result of COVID and the pandemic lockdowns, we saw that a lot of teens, kids were sheltered. They had to go home. And where were they spending time? It was online. I know in Montgomery County, we handed out Chromebooks across the board. Parents were struggling to go to work, to help with remote schooling. There was lack of supervision, or just a way that kids were connecting with other people was through social media. So that left them especially vulnerable. Hannah talked earlier about intrafamilial trafficking that could happen by family members. In Montgomery County, we have transit centers. If you've ever heard of Norristown Transportation Center, this is kind of the hub. And I know in the video earlier, she talked about at the train station or the bus stop, that was where people spent time. We also have a picture of a mall. Like we said earlier, the youth center, shelters, and even religious centers are places where these people are, again, it's a business model. They know exactly where to go. They know where vulnerable people are, and they know how to recruit and entice them from those locations. The role of technology, we know that the internet has made it easier for children to be recruited, advertised, and bought at higher rates. Of the survivors who entered the life in the past decade, 55% met the perpetrator via text, website, or app, and 75% reported being advertised online. Again, this is data captured in the last decade, so probably since like 2010, 2011, but I think we can all assume that it is skyrocketing as we are. Technology is just at our fingertips. It is not our friend right now. And we know that there are more than 150,000 new escort ads posted online every day. If you are interested in the role of technology in trafficking, I highly recommend checking out the agency Thorn, THORN. They do a lot of really great work related to this and have a ton of good statistics and resources for both caregivers and children, as well as professionals. And then we also had a presentation last week from NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they have a ton of resources about online safety. They have a whole program called Into the Cloud for kids, but then they also have a bunch of resources for kids and adults, maybe if they send or receive an image that should not be online, how to get it removed, what those resources are so that it can stop the victimization before it is shared so many times across the internet. When we talk about red flags, this is something that a lot of people want as something tangible. Like, we're all in social services, we're working with victims. What can we do to make ourselves aware? Like, how would a victim present? We know that there's certain indicators, like we talked about, the history of running away or current status as a runaway. That leaves someone super vulnerable due to lack of choice, lack of security, safety. Even just not having a safe place to sleep at night could lead to some desperate circumstances. We know that kids who are truant or not attending school on a regular basis, that might be worth looking into. There's physical signs that could be bruises, other signs of physical trauma, as well as behavioral indicators such as withdrawn, depression, anxiety, or fear. These kids might show up to programs maybe hungry, malnourished, or dressed inappropriately, maybe for the weather or for their surroundings. You might notice a sudden change in attire, their behavior, relationships. Maybe they're talking about like an older boyfriend or girlfriend, or an older friend group that they're starting to hang out with, or crew that they're running with. That's worth maybe asking some questions like, who's that you're hanging out with? Can you tell me more about your new boyfriend? Things like that. We do know that substance use and abuse is a huge indicator and red flag. Oftentimes children, when they're introduced to drugs, it could be in exchange for a sex act, but it also is a way to maintain control, so getting them addicted to drugs. A lot of times we talk about like branding, tattoos, things like that. They might have like a barcode. It could say daddy. Again, it might not always be like that in your face. It could just be something that catches your eye. And maybe it's worth just asking them, like, is that a new tattoo? Like, what does that mean? What did you get that for? Other red flags, like I said, referencing sexual situations or terminology beyond age-specific norms. Multiple cell phones. We know that sometimes they have like burner phones, or phones that you know that they really probably wouldn't have the means to have multiple iPhones. Sexually explicit social media accounts that you might see. I talked about mentioning an older boyfriend or girlfriend who might be, maybe they talk about like some controlling factors or not being able to speak for themselves. They might talk about a lack of control over their personal schedule. They might not have their own identification or documents. Sometimes kids talk about like traveling to another city. In Montco, that could even be like a teenager talking about like, oh, I'm going down to the city this weekend with my older boyfriend or girlfriend. Like, we're going to go do this and that. And it's worth asking a little bit more about what they're doing. And then evasive about where they live or who they live with. I want to make sure we're monitoring the chat. I know Hannah's answering, but Corinne said, I know of a situation where a person was targeted for face-to-face contact, reviewed public pictures on social media, reading the comments and fabricated a story. So familiarity, that is huge. like Hannah mentioned before, is maybe friending, so sending friend requests to a bunch of different of that group of friends, so that it looks like, oh yeah, everybody knows Dave, like he's friends with everyone. So it is that sense of familiarity. If you ask kids nowadays how many friends they have or who their friends are, they're not just going to name like 3 kids in their class. They're going to name like thousands of social media contacts, people that they've met that are part of like fan clubs or special interest groups. Their concept of friends is so different than what we all grew up with. So keep that in mind. These are our red flags cards. These are a deliverable that we did share in the resources for this, but we did create these red flags cards that we can give to any service providers, whether it's law enforcement, our domestic violence agencies, our Office of Children and Youth or Child Protective Service workers, so that they can have this ready when they're working with someone who's vulnerable. They can ask themselves these questions like, are they free to come and go as they wish? Are they in control of their own money and documents? Are they accompanied by a significantly older adult or allowed to speak for themselves? They can kind of go through this, and then if these red flags are identified, they can simply turn it over for the resources. So here in Montgomery County, these are the steps that we ask all of our service providers to take. Obviously, if the victim is under the age of 18, we talked about the Child Protective Service laws. A Childline report should be generated either by calling Childline or making an electronic report. In Montgomery County and some of our surrounding counties, we can also use the services of Salvation Army. They have a program called Salvation Army's New Day to Stop Trafficking, but they can access this hotline right here. And then any county in Pennsylvania and across the United States, you can use the National Human Trafficking Hotline through Polaris, and that's a number that you can call or a text that you can send. And that is not just for survivors or victims in the moment. It can also be used for service providers. So if you're working at a domestic violence agency and you're working with someone that has these vulnerabilities or risk factors, you can make that call and they can help you with services. They can help point you in the right direction or run things by them. And then again, down the side, we just have those definitions from Shared Hope that are easily accessible. We wanted this to be right at our service providers' fingertips. And we share those across the county. Here's another case example when we're talking about risk factors and vulnerabilities. We have Adam, who's a 15-year-old youth who lives with his mom, who is a single mother that has a history of contact with the police. Adam has had a case with OCY, that's our Office of Children and Youth, on and off over the years that initiated when he was 10 years old and was sexually abused by one of his mom's boyfriends. His mom has struggled to care for Adam due to her own substance use disorder. As a service provider, you meet with Adam again recently because he has had multiple runaway incidents and is now not attending school. During an investigation, law enforcement identifies that Adam has been communicating via Snapchat with a much older man and sending him sexually explicit photos. In their communications, they're referencing hanging out and drinking alcohol. So you can write this in the chat box. What are some of the vulnerabilities or red flags that you might notice with Adam? So vulnerabilities and red flags. History of sexual abuse, absolutely. So he had a case that was initiated when he was 10 years old and was sexually abused by his mom's boyfriends. We know that's a very high risk factor of childhood sexual abuse. Sexual communication with an older individual or even just hanging out with an older person. Again, perfect. As a service provider, if someone starts mentioning like an older group of friends, an older boyfriend, girlfriend, you see that they're referencing hanging out and drinking alcohol. That doesn't exactly mean that that child is being trafficked. It's worth opening the door to conversation and just asking a couple more questions. Someone said truancy. Again, yeah, absolutely. He's not attending school. Prior childhood sexual abuse. Substance abuse in the home. Again, that's the family environment could be a huge risk factor. Grooming by an older individual. Communicating via Snapchat. We see these cases all the time. Substance use in mom, lack of supervision. Exactly. These are all really great examples. Lives with single mom, history of sexual abuse, runaway incidents. Absolutely. So hopefully these are kind of gives you an idea of where you might see risk factors or vulnerabilities or red flags start to display themselves, and open the door to conversation, just to kind of start the conversation to ask a little bit more information. Thank you all for your participation. We appreciate it. And now we are going to show one more video. This is called The Making of a Girl. This is produced and narrated by, it was produced by a filmmaker, but narrated by Gem's Rachel Lloyd. Hannah and I were very fortunate to go to New York City for a 3-day training with Rachel Lloyd, who is a survivor and advocate who has an amazing organization. But this film is a little bit old, so it's a little bit grainier, but the words are super powerful, and we'll break it down a little bit afterward.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at. And he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I'm depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club and he puts you up on the stage and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do. And yet, there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 cents, and he takes you to McDonald's. And he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that you made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And you feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get. And everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it will be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize the daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in the Cadillac, and you're eating McDonald's, and you're listening to 50, and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
So we have about 30 minutes left in our presentation. We did just want to leave some space to reflect. If you have any takeaways or anything that really spoke to you in that last video, I offer you to please write them in the chat box. Just give us some time to reflect on what we've been talking about. But that is, as we're moving through, a perfect segue to really talk about the impact of victimization. I think Rachel Lloyd set it up for us perfectly when she talks about this horrible thing that happened where she is being bought and sold and traded. She's exchanging sex acts for something of value. And that was something so simple where she's getting money and giving it to this guy. And she says nothing else matters because they're riding in the Cadillac, they're listening to 50 Cent, she's eating McDonald's. And she looks over and that's the only person that cares about her. Like that's her person. And I really think that speaks to the impact of victimization and the trauma bonds that are experienced by people in the life. So in this next section, hopefully you've all had some training in trauma, but just to make sure that we're all starting with the same baseline knowledge. Trauma is a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of the usual human experience. So we all experience stress, we all experience some sorts of adversity throughout life, but trauma often involves a sense of intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Many of the behavioral symptoms that we might see in the individuals that we work with are a direct result of adverse experiences. So it might look like maladaptive behaviors where they're appearing like agitated, frustrated, anxious, depressed, oppositional, but really that's a maladaptive behavior that was actually a misapplied survival skill. People who experience trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation are experiencing complex trauma. And complex trauma and experiences can be defined as stressors that are repetitive, prolonged, and cumulative. So we know that it's oftentimes escalating over time, the number of dates per day, the number of people that they're being abused by. It's often interpersonal. It involves direct harm, exploitation, or maltreatment by either a primary caregiver or another responsible adult. So think back to those relational factors where we talked about it could be someone who is appearing like a boyfriend or girlfriend or a friend, or even like a father figure or a parental figure, someone who's providing for them, making sure they have a safe place to sleep, food, shelter, clothing, things like that. So it's interpersonal, and that harm is so hurtful. And it often occurs at developmentally vulnerable times. So think back to that video, we talked about the girl who was only 11 when she entered the life. If I think back to myself at age 11, I was so vulnerable to anything in society. So to think that these really adult things were happening to a child can really speak to the complex trauma. Monica said it's been a little bit of time since I worked directly with young victims of CSEC. Listening to that recording was hard because it was such an incredibly common story. You closed your eyes and could hear so many of the kids you worked with. Monica, thank you so much for sharing that. I just got the chills just thinking sharing survivors' stories and amplifying their voices is so important. And it's amazing that you say you can still just close your eyes and see their faces. Those are things that you take with you in your career, that you hold those children in your heart as you move through it. And I appreciate you, even though it's been a bit of time that you've joined our session today. It still is relevant. It still is something that we're working with and seeing and trying to overcome. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for sharing that. How trauma may appear. So like I mentioned a little bit before, people who have experienced trauma or trafficking, they may come across as deceptive, manipulative, uncooperative. You may even notice the sense that they're protecting the perpetrator or even protecting the sex buyer. This could be when like an authority figure steps in, whether it's a law enforcement investigation or a social service provider who is trying to get them out of the life. But again, these are misapplied survival skills. These are things that protected them or kept them alive in the situation. But during an investigation, it can be frustrating and oftentimes hinder an investigation. And this is a result of trauma bonding. So for those of you who are familiar with trauma bonding, it's this phenomenon of victims developing emotional attachments to their abuser or captor. You might also know it as Stockholm Syndrome, which goes back to a bank hostage situation where victims were actually showing empathy and cared about their captor in the moment. So it really speaks to the relationships that are formed and these bonds that are formed. Dependency and isolation bring the victim into prolonged contact with the perpetrator, and it creates this special relationship, which is one of coercive control. And we know that the goal of the perpetrator is to instill in the victim not only the fear of death, but they have this sense of gratitude for being allowed to live. So imagine if you knew that the perpetrator, what they were capable of. Maybe you've seen them beating another girl, or you see them fighting. You know that they have access to a gun, or you know that they know a guy or someone that could really cause you harm, that you would have this immense gratitude that they are not doing that to you and that they've allowed you to live. And that really is the root of these trauma bonds. And it's one of the biggest obstacles that we need to overcome with survivors in their healing process. What does trauma bonding look like? Sometimes we see mutual positive feelings by the victim towards the abuser and vice versa. It could on the surface look like a very loving or normal relationship. Sometimes there are negative feelings by the victim towards family, friends, or authorities trying to rescue them, support them, or win their release. Again, sometimes like on TV, you think that this is going to be like someone who's cowering or shackled or in handcuffs in the back seat, whereas maybe law enforcement pulls them over for like a broken taillight. And when they see like, oh, there's two young girls in the back, like let's question them and see what's going on. They might have really negative feelings towards law enforcement, and they might actually be supporting the perpetrator, covering for them, lying for them, saying, oh, that's my brother, we're just on our way home, no big deal. They're not asking to be saved in that moment or rescued. The victim oftentimes believes that they have some control over the abuse, and they may be hypervigilant towards the abuser's needs. So walking on eggshells, trying not to ruffle any feathers or step out of line, because it minimizes the harm that they will experience. And then they might blame themselves for their situation and the abuse that has happened. So feeling like that they misstepped or that they did something that led to where they are, or that they do have control over the situation and that they're doing it by their own free will. So these are things that we might see in working with survivors. If you're familiar, I know we have some people who work in the domestic violence field. This is really similar to the graphics that we show, where it's really hard to leave the life. So if you see the point of entry, there's pre-contemplation. So not yet acknowledging that there's a problem behavior that needs to be changed. Maybe just going through the motions, being in this relationship. You're first introduced that like, oh, I do need to have sex in exchange for money to pay the rent. Contemplation could be acknowledging that there's a problem, but not yet ready or sure that you want to make a change. Like maybe being like, this is kind of messed up. I don't want to do this all the time. But this is better than the foster care situation that I ran away from, or the abusive family environment that I was trying to get away from. Where preparation, maybe you start to come to terms that you're prepared to leave. Maybe thinking about who a safe adult is. Maybe there's a teacher at school that you feel like you could talk to, or maybe you have an older sister in the neighboring town that you could start to maybe make preparations to live with. And then action, that's changing behavior, maybe speaking up and telling someone, or leaving the situation, maybe saving money to get out of it. And once you're out of it, it requires maintenance, like leaving any kind of abusive situation. Maybe that means having like stabilization where you have a safe place to stay. You have someone else who's helping provide food, clothing, shelter, and all those things that kind of led to that before. Maybe that means getting into trauma therapy and talking to someone about the vulnerabilities and that abusive relationship that you were in. So we need to get to that stability part. But obviously with any kinds of abusive relationships, there's often there's a chance of relapse. And this can happen many times. That could be returning to old behaviors and abandoning the new changes. And that could happen by triggers. Maybe you're in a foster care situation and they start kind of laying down the law. Maybe there's curfew is put into place, or you get your cell phone taken away. Maybe your grades aren't good, so they start to limit your after school activities. Or maybe even it's just thinking like, I really did love that person and I want to go back to him. So there's that chance for relapse and then entering all over again. So we know that it's a vicious cycle, and it's not usually just like a one and done, get out of the life type thing. So we really, as a society and as service providers, need to build structures and social service systems in place in order to get to that stability and help survivors maintain stability. So in part 4, Hannah's really going to guide us through Montgomery County's response. And we have about 15 minutes to share with you what we've been doing here.
All right, thanks, Michelle. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Montgomery County. So thankfully, we were fortunate enough to be awarded a grant from PCCD to create a response to human trafficking. And so that started the beginning of 2019, and we actually just, I feel like, wrapped up recently with the edits and changes to our protocols. So we had over 20 plus partner agencies involved in this work. And we met bi-monthly, we met quarterly as a group. We had 5 different subgroups who were meeting and working on specific issues within our response. So that could be identification, providing services to victims, actually writing our policies, law enforcement, prosecution groups. And they were all comprised by different multidisciplinary team members. So our hope in sharing about what we did in Montgomery County is that maybe it will spark an idea, but obviously you're the experts in your county, the resources that you have, you're knowledgeable about those things. So our hope is really just to create a discussion and talk a little bit about what we've seen successful here in Montgomery County. So starting at the very beginning, obviously the first thing that we needed to do was establish that there was a need for change, that there was a need for a really intensive collaborative CSEC response. So we know that there's no standardized response to CSEC across the state of Pennsylvania. And we certainly know that these victims of CSEC and sex trafficking are extremely transient. We always say child abuse has no boundaries. It has no county lines, right? A lot of the kids that we're working with are running into Philadelphia, to Delaware County, to Bucks County, wherever it is. There's oftentimes a lot of movement in these cases. There's also no available data regarding the number of CSEC cases in Pennsylvania, which is really crazy, right? Because when you're trying to win stakeholder engagement and you're saying, well, actually, there is no available data about the number of kids that this impacts, it's really hard to get people's buy-in And it's often dismissed with a "not in my backyard," this sort of NIMBY attitude. So it was really important to get a little bit more data around the issue as it presented in Montgomery County. And lastly, we had a forensic interview that was incredibly challenging at Mission Kids. Over time, we were seeing an increase of these cases. And so we are applying our more routine response to child sexual abuse that is incredibly effective. It works really well at our CAC. But when we applied it to these cases, it didn't go well because these cases, we talked about the trauma bonds, the complex trauma, that when we had a child, a teenager come in for a forensic interview, which is on camera and is streamed directly to the Office of Children and Youth, prosecution, our family advocates, law enforcement. The child's on camera saying, "I'm not a victim, I chose to do this," et cetera, very confrontational, understandably because of the complex trauma, the trauma bonds. But we quickly learned that the routine response we had at our CAC didn't work for this population. So we needed to begin thinking about how we can do better for these kids. And ultimately, we knew this wasn't something that we could do on our own at Mission Kids, that we had to have a really, really strong multidisciplinary and stakeholder buy-in. It absolutely was a team effort, and we certainly wanted to leverage the expertise of our partners because we knew we needed a really expanded multidisciplinary team on these cases. You can see all of the people who really need to be involved in the response to sex trafficking to provide a really holistic, strong wraparound response and services to these kids. And like I talked about, we had a number of different subgroups. They met around different areas and they came together over the course of 2.5 years to do this work, which we're so appreciative of.
And just for those of you, I wanted to add, for anyone who's not familiar with Montgomery County, I talked about how big we are and densely populated. We have over 50 police jurisdictions in Montgomery County. So I think that speaks to how much buy-in we needed. We, at the time, did not have a special victims unit. We didn't really have any like centralized law enforcement response to it. So this was a big undertaking to do.
Thanks, that's a great point, Michelle. So again, we could do a whole deep dive, a whole presentation just into this grant. So we're trying to go through it pretty quickly, but what were the outcomes of all of this work, all of the time, all the funding that we had? We developed a CSEC MDT response and protocol. So we developed it and we implemented it and we continue to implement it. So we created a response specific to Montgomery County for children, but also for adults. And we also created a more generalized version, which is a statewide model protocol to respond to these cases. And I believe they are accessible as our handouts if you want to take a look and see what we came up with. We want to share everything we possibly can about the work that we've done. We're very open to sharing anything you might want to see. We also created, we produced and distributed different resources. So we created the red flags card that we showed earlier. We created resource posters for victims, which are put up all throughout victim service agencies in our county, transit stations, et cetera, to help victims maybe self-identify. And that was such an incredible experience. The survivors actually picked the language and said like, hey, if I were still in life, this is what would resonate with me. So that's something we're really proud of. And then we also created so many different discipline-specific workshops and trainings. We have a curriculum specifically for law enforcement, specifically for prosecutors, for victim and social service providers. And again, as we've continued to do this work, this has all expanded so much. We now have a training for medical providers, our Office of Children and Youth, our community partners. We have a prevention education program for teens. The work that we do just, it continues to add on. So the next slide you can see is our protocol response. And I'm sure that looks really overwhelming with the amount of boxes. But a lot of times when we show this for service providers, we say, hey, the most crucial thing is that you're making that child line report, because I that's like the second box down, right? So we suspect, you make the report, and then it launches this whole response. So hopefully, normally we see people like breathe a sigh of relief. There is a tailored response to these cases. The biggest thing is really identification and making that child line report. Again, we could totally deep dive into this, but I'm just going to provide an overview here of our CSEC multidisciplinary team response. Obviously, our response is tailored to the unique strengths and needs of each child as they present, as they come in different ways. But again, this is just a summary of what we're typically doing. So we have a CSEC case coordinator and advocate. We spent a long time at the beginning of the grant doing a lot of research around best practice, having a lot of consultation with experts across the country. And the biggest takeaway across the board that effective and successful responses had was that they had a point person really coordinating this whole response. They had the one contact that everyone could reach out to. So our case coordinator and advocate provides technical support to our team. If they're wondering, are these red flags something, she'll advise them. Yep, make that child line report. Let's launch the response. Once that referral comes in, whether it's through our Office of Children and Youth and Law Enforcement, that case coordinator within the first 72 hours is doing three things. When she's building rapport with the child, that is really the crux of this response, is establishing trust and building rapport. Without trust, without respect, without rapport, the response is not going to be successful. She also contacts our mental health clinician who conducts the DHS Pennsylvania CSEC assessment for more information. And then she schedules the initial meeting of our CSEC multidisciplinary team. So our multidisciplinary team is coming together. It's law enforcement, the Office of Children and Youth, prosecutors. For these cases, it's extended, maybe it's medical, mental health, maybe it's the Salvation Army like we talked about. But they're coming together and assessing a safety plan, the immediate action steps that are related to what services we need to get in place and to the investigation. And then we schedule those follow-up meetings on a case-by-case basis, ensuring that this case does absolutely not fall through the cracks. Any new information in the investigation, we're coming together as a team to really collaborate. One of the major changes in our response is that we're not doing minimal fracks on these cases and getting the kid in as soon as possible to do the forensic interview. In these cases, we're waiting for the child to say, hey, I'm ready to talk about what happened to me. That they're beginning to self-identify what's going on and that their situation is exploitative. So those are conversations we're having with the child. And then we have a case review every 4 to 6 weeks for these cases as new information comes in. So that is our case coordinator and advocate, Claire. Like we talked about, and again, in the interest of time, I'm going to make this very brief. But she coordinates the response and she builds rapport with the child. She connects them to services they need. She advocates for them. She's incredible at her job. And one of the things that I think Claire does really well is that she has that rapport and she has the trust, one, with the child, but also with our multidisciplinary team. So what does success look like? Again, very quickly, it's about redefining what success is. A lot of times these kids are going to run. We hear that over and over again from Claire and our other advocate who does this work. It would be very easy to be discouraged that the kids are running and that it's scary, that feels unsafe for them. But maybe success looks like that kid after they've run, texting you to let them know that they're safe, or calling them and having that relationship where they can come to the advocate. Again, it's about redefining what success looks like for these cases. So I think these are the last two slides that we have, but you can see over time, we started developing these protocols in 2019 and really implementing in 2020. So you can see, obviously we had a couple cases coming in. That's what really drove the need for this grant and this work. But in 2019, as we began writing the policies, doing some education, we saw 13 suspected victims. In 2020, when we were actually implementing the policies, we served 40 suspected victims. And now from January into June of this year, we've already seen 46 suspected child victims in Montgomery County. And the next slide, from January of 2021 until presently, we have actually served 51 suspected CSEC victims. And again, I think we broke it out in this way to show like the individual little people, to remember like it's not just numbers, like these are 51 individual children. And I hope that's not discouraging. I mean, it's tough to sit with, but also if we're thinking about it, these are 51 kids who are suspected victims. So maybe they haven't entered the life, but they have a ton of red flags. They're at high risk. Hopefully the interventions that we're providing them are giving them the supports and resources either to exit the life or to support them from entering the life. So the next couple slides, I'm not going to get into too much, but these are just a couple of different deliverables that we created through the STOP grant. This is a poster that we talked about creating with the
And I did mention in the chat too that we can send these resources out, or they're on your dashboard, and we also have these printed if you would like us to like mail them out to you to distribute. It has a QR code that you can scan and put at like a transit center, medical provider's office, things like that. I know we have about 4 minutes left. I do just want to get to a question. I was typing an answer and figured it was easier to say it out loud. So Ashley asked about how do you get buy-in? That is probably the biggest question. I wish we had a whole time to talk about buy-in because it's hard, especially with law enforcement. Hannah and I we just trained, I think, like 55 or so of our law enforcement partners in Montgomery County. It's hard. It's really hard a lot of times to differentiate between crimes against victims, such as commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, versus this sense of choice when it comes to prostitution. We now call them prostituted persons or victims of prostitution, things like that. Montgomery County is on the cusp. We are about to hopefully get grant funding to be able to provide these trainings across the state of Pennsylvania. So we can come to your county and do the training by discipline. So we can train your law enforcement partners separately from your OCY caseworkers, separately from your prosecutors, separately from educators, things like that, so that everyone gets their own unique training. But then we also have a program in place where we can almost provide like kind of what would you call it, like mentorship or facilitating discussions between the team partners to talk about what worked well for us in working together as partner agencies, but also taking a look at what is going on in your county. Where are the gaps in services? Where is there opportunity for collaboration? How can you work together? Ashley, if you want to write to what county you're in, we can totally talk about that. But again, we're hoping to secure grant funding like starting December, January-ish, where we can then, Blair County, awesome. I'm going to send me an email because we're already starting to talk about this. But where we can actually come out to your county. Again, so you're not reinventing the wheel. We just spent like over 3 years creating these curriculums and policies and procedures. And we know it can't just be across the board adopted by every county, but we can help you by sharing what worked well for us in a very big county with a lot of partners and what might work well for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Ashley. And I'm a Blair County native, so I would love to come out to Blair County and talk a little bit more about this. But I would say that getting stakeholder buy-in, I can't underestimate how difficult that is and how time consuming. But once you really have that buy-in from people and they're bought in and they own this protocol and these policies as their own, the work comes together. But it took a lot of time to lay that groundwork. I would say that's the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome for partners across the board. And one of the biggest things is really education about what it looks like. I specifically remember a conversation with one of our partners saying, well, I thought that sex trafficking looked like this, but if you're telling me it's like when a child is exchanging sex for marijuana, we have that here. That's happening here. So when we learned how best to identify and what sex trafficking really is, it begins to shape people's perceptions of, oh yeah, this is happening here. And another thing, which I know I can't get into detail about, but data tracking is huge. If you have the numbers to say, yeah, we've served 51 victims here, and we begin tracking these numbers, we didn't have a system in place before this grant. But when we found a way to count and say, like, this is happening here, suddenly people began to listen to us. But we can talk more about that. But yeah, such a good question.
I hope that this generated or sparked interest in you, passion in you, and I really don't want this to be the end of our discussion. So here's our contact information. Please email us, call us, visit our website. We're super passionate about this and want to talk to anyone about it. And I know you guys are like our prime audience as service providers who have probably already identified a bunch of people that you've worked with. So please reach out. We are here to help and share our resources and also learn from you and what you're seeing in your community. So we would love to talk to you. Please reach out. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and please practice your self-care. I know that this is a tough topic, so please take some time for yourselves. Thank you so much. Never enough time.